Hey there, today I want to talk about 4 steps to starting your business podcast. Podcasting is a great way to make a connection with your potential customers or clients. And if you want to actually reach the right people and make it easier for you to lead to sales or get sales, podcasting is a great way to do this because it actually helps to build up a lot of trust. And we all know that people have to know, like, and trust you before they will decide to buy from you. So it makes sales a lot more natural if you can build up that trust beforehand. I've been podcasting for a while and I see how beneficial it can be. So I'm going to obviously share with you the 4 key steps so you can get started today. And before I jump into the content, I've put this together in a handy dandy guide. It's completely free. You can download this over on my website. It's called the Podcast Starter Guide. Just go to marlonmcpherson.com/podcast starter guide and you'll be able to download that free PDF. It's going to jump into everything that I'm going to talk about here today and a bit more. I'll share some tips in there. I'll share some of the tools that I use so you can get yours off the ground really quickly. Also, at the moment, I'm giving you the opportunity to have a one-on-one call with me. This is going to be a free discovery call so you can get some more of your questions answered, as well as discuss your plans for your podcast. Now, I have limited availability for these calls, so make sure you grab the guide over on my website so you can be in with a chance to actually get that call with me. Now, before further ado, let's just jump into the content. I want to preface this by saying a business podcast is different to any other podcast because you have to have some sort of a strategy that's going to lead to sales of your own products and services with a business podcast, and that's how you monetize it, versus other types of podcasts that rely on advertising or the selling of advertising or sponsorships for them to monetize it. And for those ones, they want to appeal to the masses so they can have the maximum amount of listenership. And people tend to look at those types of podcasts and they think they need to have thousands of listeners or hundreds of listeners for them to actually make a podcast beneficial to them and their business. But with a business, you don't need thousands and thousands of listeners to actually reach the right people. You can actually reach your target customers, your target clients, by being very specific about how you approach your podcast. And you just need to have a system behind it to be able to convert some of those people into leads and eventually into customers. So forget about the vanity metrics of saying, oh, I have thousands and thousands of listeners or downloads and my podcast is very popular. It's like ranking number 1 or whatever. That doesn't really matter with a business podcast because your goal is to reach your direct customers and actually have them turn into leads and customers at the end of the day and make sales with you. So that's what we're going to concentrate on here. Obviously, it's nice if you have lots and lots of listeners, but again, that's not the main goal. So I just want to put you at ease knowing that you don't need tons and tons of listeners. So step number 1 is to actually plan your podcast, is to actually do the concept, do the planning. This is where you actually determine what the podcast is going to be about, who it's for, and how you're going to approach putting the show together. So essentially, the podcast needs to be about the problem you solve for your customers. It's pretty easy for a business because you already know what you do. You should already know who your target customers are. And you should then be doing things, content around that. So people have questions that they will be asking related to what you do, right? So think about these things and pull those questions into what's called a content plan. And this is where you're going to outline what you're going to talk about. Have at least 10 topics put together, ready to go, so you know exactly how you can record your episodes, what you're going to record your episodes about. And this needs to be, again, not about sensationalism or entertainment or anything like that, even though you can add elements of these other things into it. But it's more about educating your audience, helping them see how to solve their problems and giving them golden nuggets that shows them that you're an authority in your space and have them build up that trust with you. And also plan out what your episodes are going to look like. This is another point actually, where you decide if your episodes are going to be solo episodes like I'm doing this now. I'm talking directly to you. There are no guests or anyone else that's on the show. So you could do it like that, which is the easiest way to get things started because you don't need to rely on anyone else. You can just record and get your podcast done. But you could also do an interview style podcast where you actually interview guests, or you can do a panel discussion type of thing where you just come up with a topic, you have 2 or more people just talking about the topic, and you go back and forth. So you need to decide all of these things as a strategy going forward. Now, step 2 is to choose your recording setup. So choosing your recording setup is important because a podcast primarily or traditionally is audio based. The main thing that matters here is to have good sounding audio. And by good sounding audio, it needs to be clear and it needs to not have a bunch of background noise going on. No one wants to listen to the chatter behind you or the traffic passing outside or whatever. So you need to find a quiet space that you can record in, as well as use an external mic. Now, the reason why I say an external mic is because if you're recording to a device like a laptop or a phone or whatever it is, the built-in mics on these devices are typically not that great. And if you're not like really on top of them, like close enough, it's going to pick up a lot of echo and noise, room noise that is. So the best thing to do is to have an external mic. My recommendation is to start with a lav mic or a simple dynamic mic. I've put recommendations in the podcast starter guide, so you'll be able to see what mic I actually recommend to start with. But I've used clip-on mics, I've used smaller mics, and I've used like studio quality mics. I've got multiple mics, but you don't need fancy, expensive studio quality mics to get a good sounding podcast. As long as people can hear you clearly, again, that's what matters. The next thing is to have a way to record, right? So you need a computer or even a phone. You need something that has the ability to record in some software. So if you're on your computer, there are tools you can use on Mac or Windows to actually record for free. I've mentioned a couple of those as well inside the guide. And you can record to your phone. Right now, I'm recording this to my phone. It's a Galaxy S series, an older model one. So it's my S20, I believe, my other phone. And it basically is good enough quality to plug in my mic into. Just make sure you have one of those adapters because this one doesn't have a headphone jack. So I'm going via the USB-C port. And I'm just recording to the standard camera app because I'm doing this as a video as well, and you're able to basically extract that audio and use that for the audio version of your podcast, and that's as simple as how it can be. And that leads nicely into the other thing that you can have, which is optional. It's actually to have a video, do it as a video, and for that you need a camera. It gives you more flexibility being able to have a video, so you can distribute that on YouTube, you can distribute it to social media as video, and a lot of these other platforms that are going to come out in the future are going to focus on video because, let's face it, it's just way more engaging. So I'm using my phone. Like I said, you can use your phone or you can use a webcam if it's a really good quality one. Just make sure it's not less than 1080p quality, HD quality. Or you could just use a dedicated camera. I do have dedicated cameras, but for convenience sake, my phone is basically always with me. It's optional, but if you're just starting out, you don't want to overcomplicate things. You can just start with audio and go from there. Now, step 3 is to design your show. And when I say design your show, I'm talking about the visual design, because you have some assets that you need to create to actually make the show publishable and to make it look very marketable. And also the wording, what you call the podcast is important. What the description is important as well. So let's start with the latter, right? So the naming of your podcast is something you should seriously consider. With the naming of it, you could go for anything you want. It could be a branded name. For example, my main podcast is called Future Steps Creative. Now, if you hear that name, it doesn't tell you exactly what the podcast is about, but I recommend that you actually include what the name of the podcast is about in the name. For example, if you are a gardening business, you could call it something like Gardening Pastime, or Gardening 101 or something like that, where it's very obvious what it does. It has it in the name, right? And people can then say to themselves, you know what? Yep, this sounds like me, because from the title, from the name or the title, it sounds like something that I would listen to. And then the next bit is having a slogan. I recommend having a slogan that goes with it. So for example, for my podcast, Future Steps Creative, I say something like, Future Steps Creative, the show that helps you build and grow your online business around your knowledge and expertise, because my target customers or clients are people who want to create digital products. They want to create online courses or do some sort of a mentorship program. So that's based on their knowledge and expertise. And that is very specific, obviously, to my target. Right away, that singles out those people. And if it's not for you, you know straight away it's not for you. But that slogan comes after it. And then the description of the podcast, you need to be able to write a compelling sounding description as well. So that is where you're going to have that as the main show description. It just goes into a bit more detail around what you do and how you help and what the podcast is going to deliver in terms of value. You can have that in there as well. So that is the messaging side of it when I say designing the podcast, right? But then you have the visual branding. At minimum, you're going to need a cover image for the podcast. So it's like a book cover essentially, or a CD cover or an album cover for music. So normally you need some sort of a graphic. It doesn't have to be anything too complicated, but it needs to be appealing enough so it stands out when people are scrolling through and looking for a podcast. They will, stop on your show because they've seen that image. Also, you could do some other assets like web banners or social media graphics that you can use to promote the podcast on social media or to put on your website. Now, step 4 is about publishing and distributing your podcast. Of course, if you've done all the hard work to make your recordings and you're ready to get your podcast seen or listened to by other people, you need to publish it, right? It's basically sending it out into the world. You could do this by just publishing it to YouTube, right? So you can literally upload it as a audio video type of thing, or you do it as the main video and share that out as a podcast because you have the YouTube link that you can share. YouTube, at the time of writing this or actually recording this video, actually have now got a podcast category, and what they're doing at this early stage is having people put together a playlist of podcast style episodes, and then that's going to get featured in the podcast section of YouTube. At this point in time, I'm not sure how I feel about that, because it's not like the traditional way that people would consume podcasts. Because if you're an audio only, for example, it might not be, you have to definitely create some kind of video. You can't just upload the audio, but things might change in the future, so watch that space. But if you really want to do things the right way, to publish it out to all the podcasting apps, so whether this is Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, any of the ones that are out there, there are many platforms, and I'm sure there are many more to come as well. You'll need to use a dedicated podcast hosting and distribution platform. This can either be paid or free. I personally use a paid one for my main podcast, but I know about free ones that I've used before, and I've given you some recommendations or a recommendation inside the guide as well. The main thing is to really make sure you have like at least 3 episodes ready before you go live with your podcast, before you publish. Basically, you don't want to just publish 1 episode, in my opinion, because it just seems a little bit isolated if somebody finds a podcast and they just have 1 episode to listen to. If you have 2 to 3 episodes, then it's a bit better. People can just go on to the next one and consume at least a couple of them, and then they know that you'll be publishing the rest coming up. But you just got to do it to a schedule of some sort. I recommend at least once a week. There are people that do daily podcasts, and you could do it every couple of weeks as well, as long as people know what to expect. That's the main thing. The way you do this is by making sure that you have your content plan. If you go back to step 1, plan out what your podcast episodes are going to be about. And another tip I've got for you is to batch produce or batch record multiple episodes at the same time, and then you just release them over the schedule. You schedule them in advance, or at least you've got them done. You don't need to be like scrambling to get your recordings out. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to this, but those steps should really get you on the right track. And if you grab the guide, again, head over to marlonmcpherson.com/podcast starter guide, and you'll be able to get that free call, hopefully, as well. If you got any questions or comments, if you're watching this on YouTube. Leave me some comments below, and you can feel free to watch or listen to another episode right here on your screen. If you're listening to the audio version only, I'll leave any links in the description there as well. This has been Marlon from marlonmcpherson.com, and hope you enjoyed the content, and I will speak to you soon. Take care.